I would say that for the subcontinent, weaponization of history actually started with the colonial people. The British over here came in and they decided to actually weaponize our history against us. You'll see a lot of people saying Sati comes in when the Turks come in, which is hilarious because the first instances of Sati, come in 3rd century BCE when there is not a single Turk in the subcontinent at all. So I think then it becomes breaking myths on two parts. One, of course, is the fact that no, Mughals were not like that, and history of the Mughals is quite different. And they were, if you look at the amount of patronage that they were given to temples, etc., they were actually very inclusive rulers.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders and change makers from around the world. Today I'm joined by a dynamic scholar who's making a lot of buzz with her history vlogs. She's a history buff and an academic and is currently working as an assistant professor of history. My guest today is Dr. Ruchika Sharma. Dr. Ruchika, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, Dr. Ruchika, before we go ahead and start this conversation, let me ask you, where did this entire idea of, doing makeup and sort of narrating, history to people from the region, and since you do your vlogs in Hindi and Urdu language, where did this entire idea really come from?
So actually, it came up in a classroom. It was suggested by one of my students because I love eyeshadows. As you can see, I'm wearing one right now as well. So I used to wear that often to classes as well. And my students were very intrigued by this. I discovered eyeshadows at a very dark time in my life, and I found them very cathartic and therapeutic. So my student had suggested that, why don't I, make a video where I talk about history while doing, eye makeup. And I thought that sounded like an interesting idea. And I did my first episode on 30th April 2022. And I thought that the response at that point in time was very decent. I first started making videos in English because, my entire education has been in English. So anytime I, want to talk about history, I, automatically as a reflex reach out to English. But I realized, within 6 months' time that if I want to sort of expand and want to reach the people who really matter and who really need this sort of education, then I must switch to Hindi Urdu. That's when this decision, was taken. So in 2023 itself, I started doing videos in Hindi Urdu. And I think the channel has actually grown a lot since then. So
And
that's how the idea actually came about.
I mean, and as someone, who does history, as a part of her bread and butter, how has reaching out to, a massive audience over YouTube helped you in doing your job as a historian or someone who is an academic and dealing with history?
Yeah, so I think as a historian, and as an academic, I consider this as my responsibility to give back to the society and to share whatever knowledge I learn. Especially given the kind of climate that is there, political climate that is there in India, where there are a lot of myths masquerading as history, shared on WhatsApp, shared on Twitter, all these social media platforms. So I think it becomes my responsibility to do this. So I think for me, it gives me a sense of fulfillment that at least I'm doing something to sort of change the status quo. Other thing that, other way in which it helps me is actually keeps me informed about the kind of myths that are actually there, because I tend to teach in a classroom and the classroom is a lot more informed than the general audience is. So I was actually not aware of all these myths. I used to think, okay, this must be common knowledge and that must be common knowledge. And as and when I started making videos, I realized that there are so many myths. So myth busting is part of the channel that I have, Eyeshadow and Itihas. It almost became an afterthought when I realized that there are so many myths that I need to bust. So myth busting then became a very important part of the channel. Initially, the idea was just to share new facets of history which nobody knows about. But now I also do myth busting as an exercise because now, as an academic, I know that these myths exist. So I think as an academic, it has really helped me understand what kind of myths are there, and also where I need to sort of fix things, so to speak.
And where did you have to sort of, switch your gears in terms of doing your job? And like, where did you have to do things differently? versus to what you were doing in your classroom versus to what you're doing over YouTube. Certainly, makeup is one part of it. I mean, people who are in it for learning the makeup tips or something, they get to learn something along the way. But what is it apart from that you had to do differently?
Yeah, so like I was saying, I think the audience in a classroom is slightly more informed and also more open. I think given their age, they're, 18, 19-year-old students, 20-year-old students that I teach. So they are a lot more open to learning what I speak.
Right.
The medium of education over there is also English. So, it's slightly easier for me to sort of communicate there. Here, when I come to a general audience, I believe most of the audience is closed to what I need to speak, so it would require, I think, double the efforts to break that first barrier, which is that, this is an information that could actually help them, and they should actually be informed about all this sort of information that I'm putting out. And that could obviously happen by, reaching out in the language, which is Hindi, Urdu, but also, keeping it as simple as possible without diluting the complexity. That has been the biggest challenge, I think, because history is so layered and so complex. It's very difficult to, say it in as simple a word as possible. So I have tried to, which is why my videos often run into 40 minutes. Sometimes, there is a video on Somnath, which is an hour long, because, sometimes you just can't simplify and make it quick. I do make short videos as well so that, information is palatable to people, because people obviously have, especially when it comes to history, a very little attention span. So I think this has been the biggest challenge, is that people are generally very closed off. And I need to, sort of retain their attention span, and therefore, come up with shorter videos, or maybe a series of videos, which can sort of talk about one topic.
You're producing a lot of content in history, and that certainly touches a lot of sensitive touch points and is also confronting a lot of confirmation biases that people might have, or, preconceived notions that they might have about events of history or the history itself, about the region, etc. What are some of the challenges that you had to confront along the way?
So I would think, first, of course, is the trolling that I get, and it takes a huge amount of toll on my mental health. But I think I've become better at ignoring a lot of the trolling. I think there are all sorts of ideas, because I'm a woman, and then I come from um, a perspective which often breaks the beliefs of most people, I would say. History, anyway, is a fascinating subject and is bound to break your beliefs. Even till date, somebody who's been studying history for 10, 12 years now, I come across parts of history which completely, change my opinion on a particular dynasty or a particular time period. So I can imagine how shocking it must be for people to, sort of break their long held beliefs. So, there is a lot of misogynistic trolling, there's a lot of communal trolling that I get, casteist trolling, so on and so forth. All of which, I think I've become a lot better at it. And I think the other challenge, of course, is to sort of make sure that I, be regular with my videos, because, I also have another job, and then I have this. And then I also do another podcast for another channel. So, the idea is to sort of make sure that I stay as regular as possible. I am not as regular as possible as I would want to be, especially for my channel. But, I think these are the main challenges.
But how do you juggle along and sort of make sure you're balancing all those commitments as you go along your work routine?
So my first, of course, commitment is to the classroom. So I, don't compromise on that at all.
Mhm.
And then, of course, whatever time I have to divide between, one podcast that I'm doing, which I think for me caters to a larger audience than my own channel. So often my channel, like for the past 1 month, I haven't made a video for my channel. And then, of course, my own research, because I need to also write papers and write books, etc. So that also has to be there. So I try and balance as much as I can, but I think it's always my channel that sort of takes a slight backseat because of my other commitments. But I try and get back to it whenever I can.
And speaking of history, Ruchika, it can be weaponized by different actors, by individuals also. What's your view of that? I mean, how dangerous of an idea is it when people or organizations or political actors go ahead and sort of venture into that kind of exercise?
Yeah, I would think that the weaponization of history um, has always been there. It's just that, there is certain weaponization of history which is completely dangerous, and then there is certain weaponization of history which is quite normal. And I think so. For example, you have these myths about Mughals in India that that they were brutal and that they were invaders. And a lot of people tend to think that whatever the Mughals did is somehow linked to the Muslims that are there in India today, and that they must pay the price of what the Mughals did. So I think then it becomes breaking myths on two parts. One, of course, is the fact that no, Mughals were not like that, and history of the Mughals is quite different. And they were, if you look at the amount of patronage that they were giving to temples, etc., they were actually very inclusive rulers. Um, and that brutality, when it comes to brutality, I think all monarchies are equally brutal. So Mughals cannot be singled out for that. So on and so forth. And then, of course, breaking the myth that, there is no connection between whatever has happened in history and the Muslim population that is living today. But I think this connect is something that, as you correctly said, political actors really want to make so that they can polarize the nation for vote bank politics. And, I think this becomes a lot more difficult. And this is where the dangerous aspect comes because, then people sort of, make the Muslims of today the face of all the brutality that they think happened in history, and then sort of communalize the whole thing, and then you have some riots and lynchings, etc., which sadly are very common in India today, and so therefore I think it's very important not just for me as an academic but for other academics also to break these myths at every step of the way, especially this dangerous weaponization of history.
So, do you think people are more susceptible today to weaponization of history in current times versus than they were, say, you know, some decades back, or perhaps half a century in the past, or something?
I would say that for the subcontinent, weaponization of history actually started with the colonial people. The British over here came in and they decided to actually weaponize our history against us. Sort of show this idea that we are somehow, uncivilized people, and this idea that we have always been divided, which is not the case. And I think that has reached crazy heights today, because, like you said, there are a lot of political actors which are benefiting from this. So I would say, of course, the weaponization of history and the susceptibility to it is a lot high right now. But of course, there is some history to it, and it goes back to the colonial times.
And now, speaking of history, let's come to the region of Indus itself and speak about the Indus civilization itself. What do you think are some of the most well known or perhaps popular myths that you think need to be taken care of, or probably people need to just, you know, shed them away from their consciousness? What are those? I mean, you speaking as a historian.
Yeah, yeah. So I would think, I think the biggest Indus myth, which is going around today, is that we've found somehow chariots in the Indus Valley civilization because of this Sinoli excavation which has happened. Which is completely ahistorical, because a chariot would require spoked wheels, and I don't know if you've seen the Sinoli chariots. It does not have spoked wheels. Spoked wheels actually, make the chariot lighter, and that would therefore mean that the chariot can be pulled by a horse. But if you don't have spoked wheels and you have full wheels, it means that the cart becomes heavier. So then that cart is being pulled by a bull. This is like the very basic differentiation between the two. And a lot of people don't know about this. So I think that's one major myth that I've been trying to bust, which is associated.
Yeah, so Dr. Ruchika, what you're saying is that the horses were actually not native to these lands.
Absolutely not. That's the thing that I was coming to. Associated with that is the second myth that horses were found in the Indus civilization. That's absolutely incorrect.
Mhm.
They're not only not native to the land, but we have no horse-bone findings except for isolated finds. But that is not in the Indus sites at all. that is in the BMAC area, which is called the Bactrian Margiana complex. So it's got nothing to do with the Indus Valley civilization. So the Indus people were making a lot of things in their art as well. So you have the bull depicted, you have the tiger depicted, but there is no horse depicted in their art as well. So that also sort of, lends credence to the fact that they probably had no horses at that point of time. Um, and then there are these, very weird myths like there was no social differentiation in the Indus Valley, civilization, which, as somebody who's a history teacher, it's completely, confuses me. How can people think that there can be a human civilization and no social differentiation? But of course, not to make it that simplistic, there was a lot of social differentiation. In fact, very recent studies have actually proven that, there were gender differentiations as well in the Indus Valley civilization, where women were far more susceptible to violence. And this has been done by, analyzing bones which have been found, in these graves of the Indus Valley civilization. And also, if you look at their burial sites, etc., you will see that, there is clearly a rich burial grave and there is clearly a poor burial grave. So there is a difference between the two. The lining of the grave, the kind of grave goods you find a lot of luxury goods in one, and not so much in the other. So you know that there is clearly a differentiation over here. And then similarly, you have myths like there's no war or there's no violence, which again, if you look at these, in fact, there is a high incidence of violence in the Indus Valley civilization. A lot of these graves have yielded skeletons which have a lot of bone tissue injuries, which, are recorded on the skeleton. And you can then tell, okay, this is an accidental injury or this was an inflicted injury by people, who are experts in this. So I would say that there was actually a lot of violence happening in the Indus Valley civilization, which people don't know. People think there was some sort of a, peaceful, mythical civilization, but that's clearly not the case.
And now, speaking of faith or religion, which has been so pivotal to subcontinent itself, what has your observation been, or what evidence have you come across when it comes to probably the faith or different or myriad numbers of faiths that were being exercised back then, in the Indus civilization or in the Harappan civilization?
Right. So I would think that, their faith, I don't know if they had sort of an organized religion like we do today or like we did for most of history, but they certainly were worshipping, there seems to be some sort of an animistic cult, because you find a lot of animal and especially bull figurines. So a lot of people actually a lot of scholars opine that they maybe had a bull cult. Then you also have this very interesting seal, which, in India is called the Pashupati seal, but that's the incorrect name. The technical name is seal 420. And it shows this very interesting figure sitting in a yogic posture and, surrounded by animals. And a lot of people, starting from the British, incorrectly identified that as Shiv. Although it has got nothing to do, with Shiv. One of the major differences is that Shiv is a Puranic god.
But why is that you actually came to this conclusion that this is not, a depiction of Shiv?
Yeah. So I think that's because Shiv is a Puranic god. And before that, there is this Vedic predecessor to the Shiv, which is called Rudra. Now, Rudra is very different from the image which has been there on the seal. So Rudra, for example, is Pashughana, which means somebody who kills animals. But this particular person seems to be, drawing its power from animals and is surrounded by animals. So it means it's sort of, either protector of animals, etc. The other, of course, is Rudra is not a yogi, for example. Rudra is this matted hair, destructive Vedic god who, wanders in forests, etc. So he's not a yogi. Yogi posture of Shiv comes as Shiv, which is in the Puranas, much, much later, around 2nd century, 3rd century AD. And, the Vedas are 6th century BCE. So if this particular seal had Shiv in it should also reflect the same characteristics in the Vedas, but it does not. So, there is clearly a discontinuity. So it's got nothing to do with Shiv. What it is, and, this has been often put forth as an alternate explanation, which is the fact that this is probably a shaman. which is another kind of interesting facet of the faith of the Indus Valley people. You know, a shaman is a person who can appropriate the powers of animals and then heal you. You know, so for example, I'll appropriate the power of bull and then, you know, provide you strength of the bull and power of the bull, so on and so forth. So I would say that the shamanic cult seems to have been pretty strong because we have found this shaman in many seals. Actually, this is not the only seal. This just because this has become famous, people think it's only in one seal. There are many seals where the shaman is there, and you know seems to be you know a pretty powerful cult at that point of time.
And now, speaking of myths and speaking of, different historical groups, uh, Aryans are probably, again, one of those such groups where people right now, these days, even in South Asia, and even to this point, either by way of design or for deliberate reasons, are so much obsessed with them. But again, speaking of certain myths, what are those certain myths that really drive you up the wall and make you think that people should really not be going back to these myths or believing in these myths at all?
So are these myths in general in history or just about the civilization?
No, about Aryan civilization.
About Aryans. All right. So I would think one of the biggest myths that really drives me up the wall is that people think that Aryans were from India, you know, that the Harappan civilization continued and became, you know, the Aryans, which just makes absolutely no sense because, you know, now even genetic science has disproven this.
Yeah, because that's something that even we, when we were growing up, we more or less were taught along the same lines that they were probably native to these lands.
Yeah. But now, you know, in 2019, there were these two amazing studies, one in this journal called Cell and the other one in Science, both of which actually prove. So, Cell study was done only on the Indus Valley civilization sites, which proves that only Indus Valley DNA was found over there. There was no mixing over there. So, that proves that, you know, there is clearly no mixing of the Aryans and the Indus Valley civilization at that point of time. And then the Science study was done on the BMAC complex, wherein they found the steppe DNA. You know, so Aryans is the local term or colloquial term for this. The actual term is steppe pastoralists. So they found steppe pastoralist DNA. So which proves to us, and they actually have the science paper has given us a time period, you know, which is around 1500 BCE, when the first migration of the Aryans took place. And you know, this has been so now, of course, we have genetic evidence, but this has been proven by linguistic and historical evidence long back. So, if you look at the Vedas, for example, the Vedas talk about a lot of things which are not in the subcontinent. For example, Mount Mujavan, which is in the Pamir Mountains, right? So, which is not really a part of the subcontinent; it's part of the China area. So, you know, how do they? So, and Soma is said to be found in Mount Mujavan, which is a very important part of the Rig Vedic, hymns. Soma is this intoxicating plant, etc. So there are many, evidence which point to the fact that the Aryans came from outside, but people just would not believe in it because there is this idea, I think, in the subcontinent especially, that that if we can prove our history, the Vedic history, to be the first, then we can sort of lay claim to the rest of the Indian history and say that we were always there. And then all these people, like for example the Turks, etc., came from outside. But if the Aryans are considered as outsiders as well, then that sort of that myth then does not stand. Then everything actually from at one point of time came from outside except for the Indus Valley civilization.
Ruchika, you did use the word Vedas, and I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of our audience might not really know what Vedas are exactly. So could you just briefly walk us through what Vedas actually are?
So Vedas are the set of four books, which were initially orally composed by these people who are called Aryans. Part of the Rig Veda, which is the first Veda and also the principal Veda, the most important Veda, was actually composed outside of the subcontinent. Like I was saying, it mentions a lot of things which are probably outside of the subcontinent. Um, And then of course, then there are these three Vedas. There's the Samaveda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. Atharva Veda was the last one to be written, and the Atharva Veda probably, once it was, because the writing exercise became much later, came much later. So this is around 6th century BCE, and the composition of these Vedas started around 1500 BC, especially of the Rig Veda. So there is a huge time period, which has elapsed. When the Aryans first came in, they were pastoralists, which basically means that they would go to places, and not settle at one place. They were not agricultural. This is again very big difference between the Harappan civilization, which is largely agricultural, and then the Aryans, which are not, agricultural at all. They take to agriculture 500 years after they have migrated. So, this should anyway give away that they are not from the subcontinent. But anyway, and then even 500 years later, so there's a lot of urbanization, etc. So then the Atharvaved, by the way, actually has a lot of mixing of the local traditions, which are, which were here before the Aryans came in, and then the, kind of religion that the Aryans brought in, which is very similar, in fact, to the kind of religion, say, found in Mesopotamia. It's very similar to the kind of religion in the Avestan texts, for example, the Zoroastrian religion. There is a similarity between the two. The Greek religion, gods like Zeus, Heracles is like Krishna. There is a lot of similarity, which again proves that they are from this region, initially, and then they come over here to the subcontinent and, intermingle with the population.
And when you've sort of established this fact, or probably you shed away this myth that the Aryans were not really native to these lands, what were some of the traditions or rituals that they had actually brought along with them to this part of the region after they had actually settled in the subcontinent?
Right. I think the first thing that they brought is their language, Sanskrit.
Hmm.
So there is another group of people called the Mitanni, who were in the Mesopotamian area. And if you look at their inscriptions, they also have similar Sanskrit names like Subandhu, etc., which are names which are found in the Vedas. So they clearly come with a language which was spoken in that area, which is Sanskrit. And again, Sanskrit comes from outside because people over there are also speaking a similar language. In fact, Mitanni were probably the first people to speak Sanskrit, and the Aryans did later. Yes.
So, Dr. Ruchika, what you're saying is Sanskrit was never native to these lands.
No, it wasn't. Sanskrit was brought from the outside. Of course, Sanskrit was written, in this particular area. The Aryans started writing in Sanskrit much later. But speaking Sanskrit, etc., was something that they were doing in that subcontinent, in that area only, which is basically the Mesopotamian Iranian area, right? And then when they come over here, the pastoralist area, basically the steppe area. And then when they come over here, they start talking in Sanskrit and then writing in Sanskrit, etc. So that's one major thing that they brought in. Then, of course, is the religion. Like I was saying, there's a lot of religious similarities. So worshipping, like for example, Indra is very similar to Zeus. If you look at the character traits of Zeus and the character trait of Indra, they're very similar. Um, there are a lot of Mesopotamian gods. For example, there is this Mesopotamian book called the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is probably the oldest epic ever written. So if you look at their gods, etc., for example, there's a sun god over there, which is very similar to Aditya, who's the sun god in the Vedas, right? So there is a lot of similarity, in religion as well, that these people bring over here. Later on, the Zoroastrian religion is also very similar. You have a Dios over there who's the darker force. And then, of course, you have a Dev over there. So there are cognates. Cognates basically mean something which is similar in language. And they mean the same thing. So they sound similar and they mean the same thing. And then, of course, you have Ahura Mazda in the Zoroastrian religion. And then over here, you have the Asura in the Vedas. So, so there is a lot of similarity in religion as well. And also, the memory of these lands. So, for example, like I was telling you, the Mount Mujavand area, possibly Saraswati could also be a river which is outside. So, Romila Thapar, etc., who are, great historians in India, have linked Saraswati to Harappati, which is basically the Helmand River in Afghanistan as of now. And it still exists. And Saraswati is considered to be a perennial river, and that's how Helmand is. So a lot of descriptions of the Saraswati in Vedas matches Helmand. So they had the memory of this. They also brought in horses from outside, of course. How can we forget? They were the ones to bring horses. They brought chariots from outside. So all of these things were things that they actually brought over here, which were not here in India before that.
And you did speak of the burning of the corpses itself. When we speak of the people of the Harappan civilization, what would they usually do? When somebody would pass away, how would they sort of take care of the deceased?
Right, right. So actually, in the Rig Vedas, both are mentioned. So, which basically leads us to believe that initially the Aryans were also possibly, burying their dead, and then later on started to burn their dead. We are not very sure why this change came into being. But the Rig Veda actually mentions both. At some instances they talk about the burning of the corpse, and at some instances they talk about burying of the corpse. And there is not a lot of difference. So a rich person is sometime being buried, and a rich person is sometime being burnt as well. So we don't know. What is the major difference between the two? But burning, certainly the cremation aspect certainly becomes very important after the Vedas are written, especially when the Puranas are being written and Mahabharat is being written, which is 5th century BC onwards. When these people start to settle down and practice agriculture, urbanization happens. The first city states start happening, Mahajanpads, so Magadha kingdom, etc. come up. That is when I think cremation certainly becomes the most important thing, and there's almost practically no burial which is being practiced. But I think before that, the Aryans were also practicing burial.
Yeah. Now, Dr. Ruchika, a lot of what you're actually saying, sort of punctures, the myths that a lot of political actors or, certain, organizations might really believe in. How do they really tend to react to, once when they really come across, the revelations like these?
Well, I think the general idea is to sort of discard it as just something that a leftist has said, or just something which is being said by somebody who is anti-national or something like that. I am to a small person right now, but there are stalwarts of Indian history. Like Professor Irfan Habib, then of course Professor Romila Thapar, Suvira Jaiswal, Kunal Chakravarti. So there are some, and I've been taught by a lot of these people, in my alma mater, JNU. So, these are amazing people to, learn history from. But of course, you'll see a lot of these political actors completely dismissing them as just, the leftist cabal, which is, out to, and they think that, somehow bringing these facets of Indian history out is somehow, making the students feel ashamed of their own history, which I don't understand how. Just because the Aryans came from outside, what is to be ashamed of? Like what is, I just don't know. And almost all of Indian history, starting from the Aryans, has been of people coming from outside. You have the Kushans, you have the Shakas, you have the Hunas. So Turks come much later. There is a lot of crisscrossing happening even before. So what's there to be ashamed of? So this idea is completely ahistorical, and I think these are the people who are truly ashamed of the actual Indian history, rather than us people who are absolutely not ashamed. And therefore, we will talk about the Indian history as it was. We don't have anything to hide or anything to change.
It's quite very interesting. You use the term crossing of, different civilizations, different cultures, different people and nations. My question is that, we've seen throughout the history and over the centuries, we've seen, Greeks, the Huns, the Aryans, the Arabs, and, Central Asian Muslims as well as the British come and sort of, inhabit these lands as well. But why is it so that we actually see far right Hindu groups actually be more fixated on colonization of India right after the 11th century CE? Or perhaps the narrative sort of gets more intensified after the British came in. Why does that? Why is there that paradox over there in that narrative, or why is that anomaly over there?
Yeah, I think it comes from two reasons. One, of course, the British are to blame because they were the ones to divide the history of the subcontinent into three parts: ancient, medieval, and modern. And ancient was supposed to be quote unquote Hindu history, and medieval was supposed to be Muslim history, and modern was to be, the harbinger of modernity was to be the British, because they are the ones who are bringing in civilization, so on and so forth. And the idea of the medieval Indian history starts from 1200, which they believed was when the Turks came in, although the Turks come in much earlier, 1192, Battle of the Rhine, which is when Muhammad Ghori comes in. But even before, and a lot of people don't know this, Islam comes to the subcontinent via trade. The first time it comes in is 700 AD in Gujarat, where you have these Ismaili merchants coming in and carrying forward the Gujarati trade. And they do this for a very long time. So a lot of people don't know that the oldest mosque in India is actually in Gujarat, in Bhadreshwar in 1162, built by a Jain merchant called Jagaru Shah, a person who was trading with the Ismailis. And because the Ismailis were staying over here, for some time when they were trading, he thought that it would be nice to build a mosque for them so that they could pray. Right. And if you would look at the mosque, it looks very much like a temple, but it is a mosque. It has a proper Qibla wall, it has a mihrab, and which is facing west. So clearly, the idea, therefore, is that even before Islam makes political inroads, there is a very vibrant community of Ismailis and Bohras and Khojas, etc., who are over here carrying forward the bulk of Gujarati trade. In fact, they become the masters of the Gujarati trade even before the Turks come in. And the Turks come in because the trade is so lucrative, and they want to sort of capture all these areas politically. Gujarat, in fact, starting from Kutubuddin Aibak, is one of the first places that they want to capture because the custom revenues are so high at that point of time because the trade is so lucrative. So people don't really realize that. And I think that is one of the major reasons as to why, people tend to think that the outsiders were just these people. But of course, the outsiders have been much, much ago. And it's not just a political inroad that Islam had. Islam had a trade inroad and politically happened much later. Like I was saying, that Kushan has come over here from the Indochina area, and they become such an important part of the subcontinent and get themselves a title of the Devaputra, which means sons of the gods, So I don't see why should they single out just these people, but the colonial people did because they didn't want to sort of get into this, and that colonial history is unfortunately stuck in the Indian mind so badly that people are just unwilling to sort of let go. Academically, we have made that change, thankfully. We've had great historians who've broken this. So now medieval period for us starts around 7th century AD, 8th century AD, which is when all these trade routes are happening, the Gupta Empire is collapsing and all of that. Because you can actually see massive changes occurring in that period. There's absolutely no change occurring in 1200 AD. So I don't know why 1200 AD was randomly made by the Britishers, because they wanted to sort of create this idea that this is Muslim, this is Hindu, and then this is British, right? Which is unfortunate because ancient period would then mean that 700 AD when Islam comes in actually isn't all Hindu, right? Because then it also includes these Islamic traders which are coming in. But the British were not interested. So I think that idea has stuck with the people and they're unwilling to let go, although there are, of course, like I said, efforts being made to undo this colonial history.
But why do you think this idea is really being still used by political actors? I did mention the far right Hindu groups. What is the motive that is sort of serving that overall political purpose?
Well, I think the far right Hindu groups want to create what they think is the glorious Hindu history of India, which stretches, and which is why they keep saying that Aryans were from here. So they want to start from the Harappan civilization, and then from the Harappan civilization, the Aryans were also here, and we were doing great, and we had great empires. So you have Magadha and Gupta empires, etc. And then these people come in, and all the problems start from when these people are coming in. So, for example, you'll see a lot of people saying sati comes in when the Turks come in, which is hilarious because the first instances of sati, come in third century BCE when there is not a single Turk in the subcontinent at all, right?
And how did that come about?
And there are many such incidents, even before the Turks come in.
How did that, that ritual or practice of sati come about?
Yeah, so there is a mention of sati in the Rig Veda as well, but the Rig Veda is sort of dubious about it. It at one point of time says, a woman who commits sati will go to the heaven. At other time, it says, the woman should come from the funeral pyre and lead a life of its own. But third century BCE gives us a proper incident of sati recorded by a Greek writer called Diodorus, who says that there was this person in Alexander, fighting against Alexander called Critias, who died, and she, had two women who became widows, two wives who became widows, and one was pregnant, so she was not allowed sati, but the other one became sati. And then we have similar such instances. There's a 5th century AD Gupta inscription talking about, again, there is no Turk in 5th century AD. So there is a Gupta inscription which talks about this Gupta king who died in a war, and the woman becomes sati. There are many plays, which talk about sati. A lot of scholars are of the opinion that sati comes in when property rights of women are being discussed. And in order to not give property rights to women, sati was considered as an option. The other, of course, is to maintain caste purity, because, for upper caste widows, there were only two options. Either you become sati or you become a widow, which means, you will have to tonsure your head, which means, you have to shave your head, you'll have to wear all white, you will have to live in an ashram, you will eat only bland food. So basically, if you became a widow at 16 or 17, your life is practically over at that point of time. And it was a very strict, provision, because caste purity had to be maintained, so this was the only two option given to women, which is kind of very sad. So I think that's why sati comes about, in order to maintain caste purity and not give property rights to women. But it comes much before the Turks, come in. And because the Turks are so, curious, and they want to write everything, so they've written a lot about, for example, Ibn Battuta mentions a lot of instances of sati, which he saw, and, he was almost about to faint, because it was just such a horrific sight to see somebody, being burnt alive. Must have been horrible. And the British, of course, also note a lot of this down. So people tend to think that they are sort of the people who are causing this, but they're really not the people. There are many instances that are there even before this.
Yeah. And so before we wrap up the conversation, my last question is, and this is about the Harappan and the Indus civilization. What do you think, after having studied a lot of evidence, sort of brought about the end of the Harappan civilization? Because, in popular narrative and even in previous theories that we've come across, they would say that a greater calamity was actually the result, was actually the very reason which brought about the end of Harappan or Indus civilization. How true exactly is that? Like a great flood or something caused something like a destruction or the end of the Harappan civilization.
I would say it's not true at all, because, that's not how civilizations end. Civilizations are very resilient. Humans are very resilient. So they will not end on just one flood. In fact, if you look at the archaeological excavation reports of Harappa Mohenjo-daro, you will see the city was built and rebuilt many times because of floods. So there is clear ideas of flooding, but that does not mean that the city stopped. So what basically ended, Harappan civilization is divided into three phases. One is the early Harappan, the mature Harappan, and then the late Harappan. So what basically ends, when we talk about an end, what ended is the mature Harappan phase. Now, mature Harappan phase is characterized by what we consider the best things about the Harappan civilization. So, for example, excellent drainage systems, standardization in weights, standardization in bricks, having a very fixed ratio in bricks. So all of these things actually ended. Now, when standardization ends, mass production ends, what usually ends as a result of, or because of that, is the political dispensation. So there is clearly somebody who is managing the politics of Harappa, the state or the government of the civilization, which creates this standardization that, okay, this is how we're going to make the drains, and this is how we're going to make the weights, and this is how. So once that ends, that standardization ends, right? So clearly, what ends at that point of time is the political dispensation. Now, we don't know why it ends. There could be many reasons. Probably the flood was too severe, that the political dispensation could not take care of it. There may have been revolts at that point of time, and the political civilization fell. There could have been, say, for example, a lot of deforestation, which people have spoken about. There could have been a bad patch of weather, so there was no crop, and then the political dispensation as a result of which fell. But that does not mean the civilization as a whole ended. So the late Harappan phase starts. Now, the late Harappan phase does not have that standardization. It has, pottery, which is not so good. A lot of the times, the pottery is not fired pottery, baked pottery, does not have a lot of standardization. So, which basically tells us that, clearly what defined the mature Harappan phase has ended. So, we know that the political dispensation most probably has ended. And then we move on to the late Harappan phase. And then you have like a gap of 200, 300 years. And then the Aryans, sort of come in. So this gap of 200, 300 years, you continue finding all these late Harappan sites. And then when the Aryans come in, there is a clear shift in culture, because they go back to pastoralism, etc. Their pottery is distinctly different from the Harappan civilization. So that's how basically, the civilization declined. We don't use the word end. We basically use the word decline because it sort of gives the idea of a gradual, end, and not really a sudden collapse, which the word end is sort of, creates.
Right. And Dr. Ruchika, before we wrap it up, my last question, and this is about, someone who is actually working in the domain of history. What advice do you have for people who are already part of it, or who are already teaching history or do this as a profession? What advice do you really have for them?
I have only one advice, and especially to my fellow historians, that I think it's very important for all historians to come and also try and change the course of popular history. Academic history is not just your responsibility. I think popular history is also the responsibility of the historians. The more historians talk about academic history in the popular domain, the better it will be. And it will genuinely, help and create awareness and curiosity about history. I don't know what's the situation in Pakistan, but in India, a lot of people don't want to opt for history because they think it's boring and it's all about wars, etc. So I think for history academics, it's a big responsibility that, not just these dangerous myths, but also, to talk about history so that people actually feel interested in this subject and actually come and talk about it or opt for it and, genuinely create some curiosity about it. So I would genuinely ask them and encourage them to talk about academic history on the popular forum as well.
Dr. Ruchika, on that note, I must admit it was really great having you over for
Thank
this.
you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation with Dr. Ruchika Sharma. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content. And if you'd like to stay updated and informed on our upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.